Hey guys, today I'm talking about the mistakes or the 50 most common mistakes vegetable gardeners make when they're using raised vegetable beds. I'm going to go through each one of those and some possible corrections you can take, corrective actions you can take to make sure that your raised vegetable beds will produce the maximum amount of vegetables and will last the maximum amount of time imaginable. So the most common mistake people make when planting their vegetable garden is they don't take into consideration where the sun is. Now this is the south side and this is the north side of my garden. This side is filled with trees, shrubs, and things like that, and a fence as well. This side has very little blockages to the sun, so as it slowly comes over the horizon each day, it gets the maximum amount of sunlight on the garden. So remember, you need to take into account when you're laying out your vegetable garden to make sure there's nothing blocking the southward facing sun, that your vegetable garden will get the most sunshine each day during the growing season. So I also have to take into account, even within the bed, which is the south facing side and which is the north facing side. You're going to plant on this side of the bed. If you're mixing in lots of different types of vegetables, you want to make sure your shorter growing vegetables are on the south side and your taller growing vegetables on the north side, because if you reverse that and your taller vegetables on the south side of your raised vegetable bed, they will shade your lower growing plants and these will get taller and taller, and these plants on this side, these vegetables on this side, are going to suffer because of that lack of sunlight. Maybe not a lot, but it will make a difference. So you want to make sure that you do that shorter on the south side and taller on the north side of each individual bed. Now, as you can see, these are obviously wood beds and they were built after 2004. And that's a key to using pressure treated lumber, is that you're using wood that was post made after 2004, because they stopped using arsenic in the wood products. So even though these are maybe 15, 16 years old, we're still getting a lot of rot, and it's time to change them out. So if you don't want to use wood, you could use something like a steel container. Those are being sold, but they're a little bit on the expensive side if you have a lot of vegetable beds like I do. But I'm going to go back with pressure treated wood, and I'm going to, on the inside, I'm going to put some plastic, as I've done with this bed, to separate the soil from the wood. Even though there's still chemicals being used, the arsenic, which was deemed the most toxic, was stopped to use around 2003, 2004. So just remember, there's a lot of controversy there. You can do your own research, but putting a layer of plastic between the wood and your vegetable bed, that will keep it from leaching into the soil if there's anything in there that you're afraid might get into your edibles. Now, another problem that a lot of gardeners face when they're bringing in their own soil, whether bagged or brought in by a big dump truck, or if you're making your own, and I have a video on how to make your own quality topsoil or potting soil. I'll link that video up above. But is failing to monitor your pH. A good pH monitor will help you know what's wrong with your soil. I have naturally heavy clay soil in my yard, so I brought in maybe 500 bags of soil when I first built this. Later on, I discovered you can actually make your own potting soil or topsoil a lot cheaper than you can if you buy it at even at the big box store. And wasn't that expensive 15 years ago. Now it's gone up even more. So I would recommend making your own, and like I said, I linked that video as well. Now, another common problem with vegetable gardeners, especially in raised beds, is they want to fit as much as they can into a bed, especially if they're limited, only have one or two raised beds, and they want to just maximize their harvest. The problem with that is it can cause a lack of air circulation and also competing for nutrients in the soil. So you want to make sure that you follow the guidelines on the seed packet or whatever you're planting. Do a little bit of research and make sure that you're giving it enough distance between each plant, because they'll suffer and you'll end up harvesting actually less than you would if you would have just spaced them out a little bit further. So just remember, even using something like 5-gallon buckets, if you don't have enough space in your garden, let the spillover of seeds fall into 5-gallon buckets, and that can really help using those. I've got a video where I talk about self-watering buckets and self-watering containers, and I'll link that video up above as well. Now, the next most common mistake that a lot of gardeners make when they're using raised vegetable beds is usually their soil level isn't deep enough, and these are all about 12 inches deep, and also they've settled over time. So remember that over time your soil will naturally compact down as things degrade and disintegrate and blend into the soil. So I have to add a little bit of soil each year. This year, the entire raised vegetable bed really needs an overhaul, again, because of the wood rot, and also I need to bring in a lot of quality soil. So just remember, follow the guidelines based on whatever you're planting, such as a tomato can be planted 2/3 even up to the top of the plant, and you can, those fine fibrous root hairs on the tomato plant become an entire root system, but some plants cannot take that. If you plant them too deep, it can really do damage to the plant. So just remember, follow the guidelines as whatever best for that particular variety of vegetable in planting depth. So another thing that a lot of people don't take into account is the speed at which the soil drains. If you have slow draining soil, then you're going to need to add sand or perlite to the soil to help it drain quicker in your raised vegetable beds. You want to try to make your own, and you can add your own amendments such as perlite and sand to make sure that it's a good quality soil and you're not paying a fortune for it. So again, making your own soil will save you a lot of money, and it works a lot better in raised vegetable beds. So drainage is critical. If you're in a low-lying area and the water is pooling around your raised beds, then that's going to be a problem as well. So you just want to make sure that you create a little bit of a slope if there is a low-lying area which you're putting your raised beds. Now, another critical error people often make is they fail to mulch. Originally, I used this large shredded pine bark, but it wasn't fine enough, and I found that it wasn't decomposing fast enough. So I switched over to a very finely shredded pine bark. It will decompose quite a bit faster. Now, if you don't have access to either of those, you can use straw, pine straw, hay, things like that that will cover it and will keep the soil moist, and it will prevent weeds from growing up, because weeding in a garden can become a major task if you don't have a really quality mulch down about 2 inches deep to prevent it from happening. Now, I forget the exact number, but I've got close to maybe 22 or 23 raised vegetable beds, and I've got enough beds where I can do crop rotation. If you're growing the same family of plants in the same bed each year, there's a chance of diseases building up in the soil. So you want to remember that if you have 2 or maybe 3 beds, you want to rotate the crops so you're not always planting the exact same family of plants in the same bed, and then that way there's less of a chance of a disease killing off your entire vegetable crop because of the lack of crop rotation. Now, the next thing that people often don't take into consideration is preparing their garden for the obvious thing that's going to happen every summer, and that is insect infestation. Having something like this bee barn will draw in beneficial predators. Also have bird houses around the garden. I'll put links to all those in the description below, but remember that using natural ways to get rid of the insects that are going to take over the garden if you don't do something. Try to avoid using harmful pesticides and go for something like this that is a natural solution that will work year after year and be less of a chance of any of those toxic chemicals finding their way into your edibles. The next critical error is overwatering and underwatering, and it's easy to do either one of those. Especially if you're busy, you might be underwatering, and if you're overly attentive to your garden, you might be overwatering. But anyways, the way I originally set this garden up, it was an overspray garden that just sprayed everything from above. That was over a decade ago, and so then I came into the knowledge of micro irrigation, not drip irrigation, but I call this micro irrigation because I can put the water exactly where I want on each plant. So that's one thing to take into consideration. You can hook this up just to a normal hose. You don't have to have a complicated system, just a normal hose bib, and have it going out to your garden with a timer. So it just waters for a very short amount of time. Even in the dead of summer, these only cut on for about 1 minute at a time, maybe 2, possibly 3 times a day, depending on the heat and the lack of rain we get. So it really makes a huge difference when you switch from overwatering, which can cause diseases and other issues, to a micro irrigation where you can put the water right to the root system. Now, the next mistake that people often make is choosing the wrong variety of plants for their area. Choose heirloom varieties that are more disease resistant, and they will serve you better. Just make sure that you're carefully selecting each seed packet based upon where you live and your zone, and make sure that it's labeled for your zone. That's another critical error, is that people don't associate their zone with the seeds they're purchasing. They'll purchase seeds from the big box store regardless of whether or not they really will work in their area, and they're often sold in those stores not based upon your zone, but just the fact that they might be sold by someone who doesn't know that they shouldn't even try it. Another critical error that people often make is not taking into account that the mature size of the plant is going to eventually reach. I built this trellis specifically for Goya, which is a Japanese plant more commonly known as bitter melon. It's considered a superfood in Japan, and it's very healthy to grow. But take that into account when you're planting your garden, is you want to make sure that if it's going to get very large, that you've provided the right amount of space, or that you plan to build a trellis that will hold the plant. When Goya is in its full maturity in this bed, you can't even see the bed. It's just spilling out over into the gravel area and covers the entire trellis completely. So that's one thing to take into consideration. Always know that a mature plant will get a lot larger than you anticipate if it's in this ideal growing conditions. Now, another common mistake is planting your plants out of season, starting seedlings inside and then bringing them out to the garden way before it's time because you haven't passed that last frost date. Or if you're starting late in the season and you don't have enough time for it to go from where you're planting it, from seed to complete maturity. This device right here I'm experimenting with to see if this tomato plant can survive even in late February. It's a mini greenhouse that opens and closes based upon the temperature inside, and I've also put a water bottle inside to help retain heat. So I'm not sure the tomato plant will survive because we've got some cold weather coming up, but I just wanted to test it to see if it was possible. I'll link a video to one of these as well that'll help you figure out how to put one of these together, and you can go from this size to a much larger size as well. Now, the next common mistake people often make is failure to secure their garden against wild animals, rabbits, whatever else might be in your area, possums, raccoons, whatever might come into your garden and make quite a mess of it, especially if you have mature plants and they're ready to be eaten. I've installed fencing, wire fencing, and a little drop-off that makes it difficult for any of those animals to get into the garden without a lot of trouble. It's not impossible, but it makes it a little bit harder. Also, I've got an artificial owl that might scare some animals away, and also a motion activated sprinkler system that if something larger like a raccoon comes into the garden, it will sense it and spray it with water and hopefully chase it out. I'll put one of those in the link in the description below if you're interested in something like a motion activated animal control. And it also works for dogs and cats as well. Another common mistake you can make is using contaminated compost or garden soil that might have been treated with some type of pesticides or herbicides. That's one thing you want to make sure that you're getting it from a reputable supplier or you're making it yourself. I've got 2 videos on my channel that talk about making compost with a vermicomposter or just a standard composter using kitchen scraps and a standard trash can. It's really an inexpensive way to do it, and it works really well. So just remember, you want to make sure that you're getting a very high quality product, even if you have to buy it from the big box store. Now, I spoke earlier about testing your soil pH, but you can also purchase a soil test kit to test for nutrients and make sure that your soil in your raised vegetable beds are optimal levels. Over a period of years, you're going to have to add in more amendments such as compost and other things like that. I talked about using eggshells and I created a video about the chemical process of just taking eggshells and making them where they're bioavailable to your plants. Just throwing eggshells into your garden is not going to work as well as if you go through this process. If I've got a link still open, YouTube only allows me to have 5 links per video. So if I've got 1 link left, I'll put it up above. So companion planting is a thing that people often forget about. If you have enough space in your garden, companion planting can really benefit you in the long run. Another thing that's so critically important is access to the beds. You want to put access pads. These are about 1.5 feet. These are about 2 foot, but it allows me to bring in wheelbarrows to do extra composting, and it's not a lot of trouble. If your beds are too close together, the plants become full size, mature, you're going to have a hard time even getting in between the rows. So remember, you want to keep yourself about 1.5 feet to 2 feet in between each raised bed. That's so critical that you have the space to be able to garden, because you'll quickly become frustrated when you can't even get to the vegetables and do the things you have to do, such as pruning, soil amendments, fertilization, whatever you have to do if you don't have enough room. So over-fertilizing in a vegetable garden is a critical mistake that you've got to avoid making. Using high nitrogen can burn the plants very easily. So you want to make sure you use a slow release to start with, and then if you don't see enough growth, then you can try a little bit of extra nitrogen, but you just want that stable growth in the early parts of the season. And actually, phosphorus is probably the more important part of fertilization. The P in NPK is going to help your vegetables more than nitrogen probably will. Nitrogen does help, but phosphorus will help you produce more vegetables in your garden. Now, under-fertilizing can be just as detrimental to your vegetable garden as over-fertilizing, and that's why using organic fertilizers can help balance things out, and producing your own compost can be one of the best things you can do for your garden, and trying to stay away from those really, I wouldn't say toxic, but I would say less natural ways of fertilizing your garden. So whether it's over or under, it can be a detrimental thing either way. So pruning is very important in the vegetable garden, as it is with almost every type of garden in the bonsai world, we prune to make the plant healthier, and that's the same thing that you need to do in your vegetable garden. Pruning will help your production because pruning stimulates growth and can also produce more vegetables throughout the entire season. So just remember, removing dead or diseased parts of the plant, and also that can help with air circulation by creating a little bit smaller plant. Sometimes plants can become oversized and they will crowd each other, and that can reduce the airflow and thus create more diseases in your vegetable garden. Now, failure to take into account light needs of the plants is another critical mistake. You're looking at the north side of my vegetable garden, and there's a lot of trees just on the other side of the fence. The fence needs to be replaced, as well as above the fence, I need to do some pruning this year to allow more light to these particular raised beds, because even though the plants I plant here require a little bit less sun, they're still not getting quite the optimal amount. So just remember, when you're planting, you want to make sure that you do pruning from larger trees and shrubs around that to allow more sunlight in. Now, this area, you're looking at shade fabric that's been in the garden for over a decade, and sometimes you need to prepare for weather extremes, whether it's extreme drought or extreme periods of really dry and cloudless days where it can get overheated. So providing some shade fabric to certain vegetables are going to keep them from getting sunburned and drying out. You also want to make sure, again, as I said earlier, mulching to maintain a common soil temperature, and plan your watering schedules according to the drought things that may come along. If you have a sudden drought come into your area, you're going to want to increase your watering schedule quite a bit to make sure your plants don't dehydrate. So I'm going to do a quick rundown of the rest of the things I think that most vegetable gardeners forget when they're using raised vegetable beds. One is using harsh pesticides and chemicals. Switch over to something like neem oil or natural insecticides. If you don't have enough predators in your garden, doing that will really benefit you, and you don't have to worry about your vegetables being contaminated with some toxic pesticide. Now, another mistake people often make is failure to label their plants and the variety, the date planted, and things like that. Labeling your plants will help you greatly if it comes to seed starting. Even things like that, you'll need to label, because unless you have a perfect memory, you'll forget what you did and the dates also that you did them. Failure to monitor diseases as they develop in the garden. If you see a problem, it's better to take action right away and prevent the disease from getting any worse. I just made a video about preventing diseases in tomatoes yesterday, I believe it was. So I'll link that above if I have a link left. I think I said earlier that YouTube only allows us to do 5 links per video. So if it's not up above, look through my video catalog and you might find that pretty quickly. Now, as I said earlier, mulching is critically important to your garden. It helps maintain moisture and it keeps weeds out. But if you don't mulch and you fail to weed properly, weeds will literally take over a garden in just 30 days or less. So just remember, if you decide not to do a mulch, or the mulch you have is not thick enough, weeds will come in, and you'll need to make sure that you weed properly and quickly before they choke out your vegetables. Now, using a grid system, you can take some string and grid off each of your raised vegetable beds, and that will give you an exact idea. Such as square foot gardening, you'll know that exact space will be for that particular plant. So grid gardening or square foot gardening is a great way to vegetable garden, especially when you're using raised vegetable beds. Now, as I said earlier about crop rotation, you want to make sure that when you do crop rotation, you keep that particular family out of that bed for 2 to 3 years before returning it back to allow any diseases that might have been there to disperse and not be as bad as they were, and using a natural alternative, getting rid of those diseases, as I mentioned earlier. Now, failure to harvest on time is another problem that I've had. I'll get really busy and I'll have so many vegetables coming in at an exact time. It's hard for me to harvest everything, and those vegetables will drop to the ground of your raised vegetable bed and they will start to rotten on the ground, and that's where a lot of diseases can come from. So remember, you want to try to go out at least 2 times a week and harvest any vegetables as they become ripe. Even though we're talking about raised beds, you still want to do a little bit of tilling to help with soil compaction. Soil compaction happens naturally from the soil settling, and if you walk on the beds, that can also compact the soil even more. So soil compaction is a real thing in vegetable beds. Just make sure you take a hoe or a tiller and gently till in that area. Not a power tiller, but some type of hand tiller to help loosen up the soil and put a little bit of aeration into the soil. Another critical error that people often make is they fail when they're building their raised vegetable beds, is they fail to put down a barrier between the ground, the natural ground, and your soil that you're going to be adding that can be a problem because if you have burrows that come in, those burrowing things like moles and chipmunks can come in and do a lot of damage to the root system of your vegetable. So make sure that you put down a landscaping fabric as you put down each bed or build each bed to make sure that you don't have that problem coming in from beneath. Now, another common mistake is failure to put in enough organic matter into the soil in your raised vegetable beds. And you can do this at the end of the season, is you can plant a cover crop and let that grow throughout the winter. And then when spring comes, you can till that under, and that will become a natural part of your soil, and it will help boost the fertility of the soil as well. Now, another thing that you want to do when you create your raised vegetable bed is make sure you have room for expansion, because no matter how big your vegetable garden is, most people always want to expand it. So as you plan your irrigation system or your beds, you want to make sure there's going to be enough room for future beds if that's possible in your vegetable garden space. Now, speaking of space in the garden, you also want to think about vertical planting by creating taller structures so you can grow vertically. Growing cucumbers vertically is a great idea because cucumbers can take up a lot of space in a bed, and if you grow them vertically and give them the proper support, that can add much more vegetables at the end of your season. Now, another thing is, we talked earlier about beneficial insects, birds, and things like that. Using pesticides can also harm those creatures that are going to come into your garden and take away the insects that are going to damage your vegetable plants. So just remember that you want to make sure you try to keep as much as you can on the organic side so you can make sure that the predators that are going to take care of those insects won't be killed off by something such as a strong pesticide. Now, the greenhouse roof puts off a lot of water around it, and that's another thing you want to remember, is remember to create drainage paths. And if you can do a French drain, that would be even better, that you can move water away from your garden, because even if it doesn't affect the plants, trying to work in a garden that's really muddy is a really rough thing to do, especially when it's a little bit cool outside and your feet are soaked from walking around a muddy garden all day. So raised vegetable garden size is also something a lot of people don't take into account. I think the optimum size is either a 4x4 or 4x8, but also a lot of people don't take into account the height of the bed. If you have mobility issues, then a 1-foot high bed like I have may be really uncomfortable to work in. So something like a 4-foot bed that's been filled with maybe lumber and leftover wood products that is not toxic, you can fill that up at the bottom and then top 12 inches with topsoil, a really good quality soil, and that way you don't have to bend over quite as far to work on your raised vegetable bed. Now, one thing that people often fail to do is forgetting about adding flowers, flowering trees, flowering shrubs, and flowers themselves around your garden. That will attract butterflies and other beneficial insects. So that's one thing I would say, that even though that may not contribute to your overall harvest, it will contribute to your pollinators that come in and help your vegetable garden overall. Now, failure to add in organic things like black cow, which is one of my favorite soil amendments that can easily be purchased here in the States. It's just a composted cow manure. If you don't do composting yourself, adding something like that every year will make a huge difference in your overall harvest. Now, if you're planning on having a very large vegetable garden, one thing you want to remember is having a seed starting area, whether it's in a garage, a greenhouse, a small area inside your home where you can start seeds and you don't have to purchase all of the plants. If they've already been grown, that can become very expensive to go and purchase plants that have already been started. So having a dedicated seed starting area can make a huge difference as well. Another thing that people don't think about as they're working in their garden is proper hygiene of your working tools. Cleaning those tools and giving them a light misting with something like Listerine or rubbing alcohol will kill any diseases that are on there, on your cutting tools, on your other tools. So just remember, good garden hygiene can make a huge difference, especially if you don't want to have a sudden disease outbreak in your garden. So lastly, I think keeping a garden journal is so important, because you can put it on a laptop, a iPad or something like that, or even on your phone, and you can keep a record of what worked and what didn't, what was the most beneficial thing that you did, and what was the thing that you don't want to do again. So just remember, keeping a garden journal will make your garden much better than it normally is if you keep track of what's happening from year to year. So guys, I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, please like and subscribe. If I've left something out, or if you feel there's something important that you do that I don't do, let me know in the comments down below. So have a great day, guys.